Sorry, not sorry, Cheeto Puffs and Doritos, because the consumption of ultra-processed foods like such has officially been linked to depression 10 years later. Hi, I'm Jess. I'm a clinical nutritionist, and today we're talking about a recent article and study that followed participants over 17 years, ultimately concluding that the more their diets come from ultra-processed foods, the more likely they are to experience depression long term. So I'm going to hop over to my desk and we're going to dive into the details of this study together because there are some pretty interesting takeaways that you're going to want to stick around for. So this is the article, Diet of Ultra-Processed Foods Linked to Higher Depression Risk Long Term, that came out fairly recently. And it's based off of this scientific study here. High ultra-processed food consumption is associated with elevated psychological distress as an indicator of depression in adults from the Melbourne Collaborative Cohort Study. So this is actually an Australian study, which is super fascinating. And they followed a cohort over a significant period of time, which is hard to do in nutrition science for a lot of reasons. Say hi, Chan. He's right there. So we're mainly going to go through the article here because I think it summarizes the study really succinctly in a way that's easy to follow, but we will look back at it a few times as needed. And I will link both of these in the description below. So this is an Australian study, and I found that incredibly fascinating because I actually was not aware that Australians had a very high processed foods diet. Maybe you were. Let me know in the comments below. I've never been to Australia. And as it mentions here, Australia is a country with one of the highest rates of consumption of ultra-processed foods, with residents getting on average over 40% of their daily calories from highly processed sources. So it's almost as high as the US. Spoiler alert, we're still a little bit higher, but it's pretty significant. As you can see here, they mention how they categorize ultra-processed foods, and it's also in this study here. They have a specific category where they describe what they are classifying as ultra-processed foods. So here's a good section where it goes over high intake of fast food, red and processed meats, refined grains, sweet, salty snacks, and sugar-sweetened beverages, and just macronutrient context such as high saturated fat and high sugar intake. So that's what they were really referring to as processed foods, though they do have a few different scales on here as well. Essentially, this study followed, or they analyzed data from like 23,000 individuals between the ages of 27 and 76. And they followed these participants between 13 and 17 years. And then they continuously use certain psychological scales to measure their mental health. And there's two things that are really fascinating about what they found. The first one is that researchers found that adolescents who consumed ultra-processed foods regularly were more likely to have depressive symptoms a decade later than their counterparts who followed healthier diets. So that's the first really fascinating thing. The second is the association between ultra-processed foods and depression was unaffected by sex, age, or body mass index. It also persisted regardless of marital status, the number of people a person lived with, and their level of physical activity. The reason why I find this so fascinating is obviously there's a huge correlation between nutrition and mental health. But when we're talking about mental health, we're also always talking about just physical health. We're talking about physical activity, and then we're talking about how relationships impact mental health. And this is pretty much saying that independent of these factors, diet still played a huge impact on how someone perceived their mental health 13, 17 years later, essentially. Basically drawing an association between ultra-processed foods and mental health that appears to be linear. So in regards to the percentage, the risk became higher than what most people in our study experienced when the ultra-processed foods made up about 30% of everything that they ate. So essentially what they're saying is 30% of someone's diet coming from Doritos, the ultra processed foods, whatever that may be. When it got up to 30%, that's when there was a significant increased risk in reporting these depressive symptoms. So it didn't even have to be at 40% or the 50% that Americans were at. The article then asked some questions about where does the cause actually lie. This study was not a mechanism of action study. It wasn't really looking at what the association is or potential associations. And they put some speculations here below where they say ultra-processed foods tend to lack important nutrients like protein and fiber while containing excess amount of carbohydrate, saturated fat, and energy. These factors have been associated with gut problems and inflammation, which are linked to depression. So this is obviously a drastic oversimplification of how processed foods can impact your mood, but they're essentially pointing out that one, when we're eating processed foods, we are inherently likely not getting a lot of the nutrients that we need from whole foods. And this is the case with people that don't even eat a lot of processed foods. It's really hard to get all the nutrients that we need from our diet alone. And then secondly, it's pointing out that the actual consumption of these foods cause direct implications to either our gut or just creating inflammation in the body. And then those things are associated with depression. There's a lot of other ways that processed foods can potentially lead to depression. You can check out my channel for some of the other things I talk about regarding that. You can see here that most studies in the United States and the United Kingdom have found a contribution of ultra-processed foods to the total energy intake above 50%, while in countries such as Brazil, the consumption is less than 25%. Good for Brazil. So Australia does actually have a clinical trial going on right now called the SMILES trial. There's actually a SMILES diet. It's a whole study where they're now going to follow people that make dietary interventions and see how that impacts their mental health, which is super cool. So what I hope that you take away from this study is that consumption of ultra-processed foods not only have the potential to have a long-term effect on our mental health, but this is also an effect independent of other aspects of our life where we might be totally crushing it, like with physical exercise, having healthy relationships, etc. If you enjoyed this type of video today where I essentially went through a new article or recent study, then let me know in the comments below, because I'm always geeking out on recent studies that come out. So if that's something that you want me to share with you, then I would be happy to do so. And if you're interested in learning more about the connection between depression and nutrition, then check out this playlist up here that's all about depression and will give you a really good foundation of where to start. So hopefully I'll see you in some of those videos.